Hey everybody, it is Matt Weaver with Roy Troyer here on the Bible Truth Project channel, and we got another one of these tantalizing. It's me being sarcastic, but it's actually going to be a good subject. It is biblical weddings. Um, an odd subject, but it was one actually kind of stirred the other week when I heard we have some young couples in church, and the question came up of weddings, and I guess people have their own opinions about what weddings are, and I was like, oh, that's a subject that we could talk about because I don't know that there's a lot of people that talk about what a biblical wedding would be or what it should be. Or I'm not saying we even are making that kind of summation that we would have a conclusion, but we can at least explore the subject to figure out um, from a biblical point of view what we should be looking for. Is that fair?
Sure.
Okay. Well, Roy, um, I mean, I guess I could take, I normally push you to begin with, so maybe I'll give you some of my opinions up front and then we can discuss it. And hopefully it turns into a heated debate because people love debates.
I
Um,
doubt it. I'm not that passionate about it, but it's an interesting subject, though.
well, it kind of is. And if you look at it purely from a humanistic standpoint, marriage is kind of a weird thing. I mean, if you look at it from the animal world, you have animals, you've got some animals that are together for life, you've got some animals that are together for the season of offspring, and there's kind of all in between. And it is kind of interesting how that all works. And then here in the human side of things, we have this concept in society, really going back to the beginning of civilization, of something more than just a relationship. You have this thing called covenant, eventually kind of follows the line of being called marriage. Um, but a covenant is throughout a lot of history in the marriage, at least for marriage, is something that is considered essential in society. It's not really optional. People are like, we're going way back. We're going back to the beginning of civilization. You already have this whole thing of kind of covenanting. And I guess that's kind of where my angle would start. And it's interesting. I guess when you look at I mean, we're specifically looking at biblical weddings, not necessarily secular or other religious types of um, things, but all of it has to do with the fact that in the biblical position, and this goes back to the episode we had on patriarchy, and some people, get quite offended and feisty when you deal with things like this, but it has to do with the protection of a in traditional society, a woman is at a disadvantage because of this physical strength, the ability to go out and to take care of themselves physically. Um, they are somewhat of a disadvantage, at least from a physical strength standpoint. And so it was thought of as, marriage was not only thought of as protection, but as also to help supply needs. It was later on that marriages became political alliances. Hence why Solomon had as many wives as he did. He was making political alliances with neighboring countries. And you basically, if you marry, you're not going to fight your family. So, well, maybe you will, but in short, you have kind of this, it kind of is born out of protecting women. It's born out of protecting their rights and their status and their position in society. And later in the Bible, interestingly enough, you have several examples of like a biblical marriage story, and one of the probably the most uh, earliest ones that I recall would have been the story of Isaac and Rebekah. when Abraham sends a servant into the home country to find a wife for Isaac. And saying, is that right? Isaac and Rebecca? Yes, Rachel and Leah. Okay. Is my
Yeah, that
brain
would be
working this
subsequent.
morning? Just wanted to make sure it's right because we don't be called out as wrong. But you have this whole story and you get a picture of biblical marriage, really that the pattern that follows, and a picture of what happened in the ancient world because you have Eleazar or Eleazar going into a back to the homeland and finding um, Sarah's brother, if I have it right, and picking one of the daughters and bringing her back. And, it's love at first sight. No, actually, it brings up another issue. These were arranged marriages. Ancient marriages typically were arranged marriages. They weren't actually love marriages.
Right.
And the fathers, it was the parents' responsibility to try to put matches together. And that's still the case in countries like India. In some of those cultures, arranged marriages are still a thing, and in some cases preferred over love marriages. And I know it's extremely bizarre to us in the West, but I guess that's one of the first observations for myself is that, interestingly enough, a hypothetically more biblical way, if we're looking at the ancient text, right? More biblical way of doing marriages is actually love marriages. Interesting enough, in Jewish society today, amongst the Orthodox, you'll have more of a arranged marriage kind of situation. It's almost like a hybrid. What they
But
tend to
it's not by
do,
the fathers, right?
well, what they do is they tend to get a matchmaker when somebody's looking for like a man is looking for a woman, they'll tend to get a maker involved, and she'll know who's up, like what's up and who's available, and
Who's on the market?
who's on the market. And they'll arrange a meeting. And I've been in Israeli hotels many times where I've seen like these meetings take place. And so the
Okay.
parents will bring the kids, and then they will meet in view of the parents just by themselves, and they'll talk and have kind of a conversation. And basically, if the man's interested, he'll pursue at that point to have another meeting or so, and eventually he will propose. And it isn't like dating where they're going out to eat alone and all that kind of stuff. It's only a few meetings and a proposal is given, and if it's accepted, and this proposal is done by the fathers to each other, and following the historical idea, I guess, of back in the day, you would have had a bride price, a dowry that would have been requested for the hand in marriage, and it's very transactional, and they set a date for the wedding, and then the wedding happens, and yeah, they're married. So it's interesting that the Jewish world has kind of followed the ancient traditions. When I say the Jewish world, the ultra Orthodox, I would
Hmm.
say the conservative Jews are definitely not doing that, and I'd say most Christians are not doing that.
Right.
We follow more of the love marriage idea.
Yep.
And but anyway, so then you have the actual wedding itself. And this is where the ancient world highly outdoes the modern world. So I had studied a lot of this for my own wedding, and I was trying to understand what biblical weddings were. And I, very quickly ran into problems because there was a lot of drinking, a lot of partying, days on end. Josephus
7 days
says
in a
that.
row.
Well, yeah, Josephus says that it was actually the financial ruin of many families was
Oh
weddings
my word.
because it was the time that you were able to, like, I don't know, go all out and just
Right.
live it up. And weddings were that opportunity to just go all out and just, you know, basically put on a giant party that and that's really the format. I mean, you have Jesus's miracle in Cana.
Hmm.
It's, and of course, from our conservative culture, that people want to argue that he turned water into grape juice because we serve grape juice at weddings. Ridiculous. I'm
Except
sorry.
it doesn't say grape juice.
Well, it's the Hebrew. Yeah, correct. Well, yeah, it's not Hebrew, it's Greek, but it's still fruit of the vine is the way it gets put. And so many people argue that it isn't fermented, it's fruit of the vine. Well, yeah, but you're in a desert culture and it's hot and it doesn't take very long for that product to either turn, there's no refrigeration, so you can't keep things juice and they don't exactly have canning like we do today where you could can it and preserve it. It is turning either to wine or vinegar very quickly. And
Right.
I'd asked a rabbi friend over there sometime, I said, this is actually a discussion in the conservative circles that we come from. Like, would it have been wine or is it grape juice? And, most of them were like, it's grape juice. And he just laughed and he said, well, they obviously never been to Israel. So,
Well, I mean, wine was very much a part of the culture even preceding
absolutely.
that. Like, it's just obvious that that was not an issue, here in America, and even, of course, even more so in the, like you were saying, the conservative circles that we might be rubbing elbows with. It's alcohol is far more taboo than it was in biblical culture.
Yeah. Well, and part of it was, they didn't have the alternatives. If you wanted something special to drink, pretty much most of it had alcohol or of some sort because of the nature of trying to create some concoction. They didn't have Kool-Aid.
No
There's
energy
no
drinks.
there's no Celsius, right? Not that they're sponsoring this. That was just an opinion. So in short, I mean, you have this pattern in the ancient world. It was a giant party, and then there was the covenant. The whole point of the wedding was actually to make this covenant.
Hmm.
And it was before God and before people, specifically before the parents. And of course, extended family would be there. But the point was the covenant. And I won't use the word because, that'll elevate our problems. But then there was the physical union that took place during the event and the showing everybody of that the deed
Virginity
had been
cloth.
done. And then it was
Judgment Day.
and then it was considered to be an actual marriage when the physical union took place. And as best I can tell, in ancient culture, it wasn't a private event. When I say private, it was a semi-private event. But the parents, I think the fathers would be there, and the one witness, I guess is where we get the idea of best man from what I have gathered. But it was witness to the deed and to the action that it became so on and so forth. And so, yeah, we've deviated a bit, I would say, from the whole biblical wedding scenario. Sort of. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we're also far more bride oriented in our Western weddings, obviously, than they were back then from start to finish. It was very much groom oriented in the biblical weddings, whereas nowadays it's very much the bride's day. And of course, because the reason for that was, the way that weddings were set up, and the whole culture and process surrounding it was to create symbolism of Messiah. So that all makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically the when a contract was made, the law stated that he had to go and build a house, and he needed
Hmm.
generally the bride price. You needed X amount of. There were conditions. Let's put it that way. You need to have X amount of money. So according to I believe it's Talmudic tradition, there was a couple years of income that was needed so that they could take a year off. Because the according to the law, the first year of marriage, a man really wasn't supposed to work. So he was
Right.
supposed to basically hang out with his wife. So you have this this emphasis on preparing. Okay, there's preparation that's taking place. There's a price to be paid. There's money to be had to be able to start a household. And all of that is really to protect what marriage does. Okay. So it is you're bringing a woman, like as a man, bringing a woman into my life, and now I must take care of my wife, and
Right.
also potential children. And so I am not just taking care of myself, I'm taking care of other people, and there's
Mhm.
responsibility involved. And if you can't meet the basic conditions necessary for that to happen, you shouldn't be married in the first place.
Right.
And it's really that core responsibility is what I basically the way I see it. It's attaching responsibility to the relationship. Back in the day when we had a different, I was on a different channel and we were debating, this whole thing. I said nowadays there is all of this un unresponsible procreative activities going on,
Right.
using very explorative language there. Um, but there's and it's and the whole point of the society was trying to take the responsibility away from it. They want to have the
Right.
activity, they want to have, the positivity of it without the dealing with the emotional side of it and the actual reality that offspring that children can come from it. So if you can take those consequences away,
Hmm.
now suddenly, you can just have fun and there's no strings attached, quote unquote. But it's not really how it works. There's always consequences to actions and activities and things of that nature. And so marriage protects that. It is a covenant, it's a contract, it's something that protects it. But as far as the wedding itself, yeah, I guess I've talked now for a while. I'll let you talk, and then I wouldn't mind getting into, I guess, it'd be fun probably for people to listen how you got married.
Me?
And yeah, and myself too. We can go through how we did our weddings and talk a little bit about the thinking behind it, I guess. And but anyway, your turn. You must speak now.
All right. Well, did you want me to get into my wedding right away, or what are you
No, no,
implying?
no, no. Just you give what you had up front, and then we'll get into the wedding.
Well, yeah, I mean, you covered a lot of what my opening monologue would have been. Um, so it was, in some ways, the whole transactional way that they went about it was good in so much that um, there was no clouded thinking, obviously, involved in the whole process. And, you might look at it and say it's kind of a cold process, the way that you had the groom's father contacting the bride's father, and they even went so far as to, draw up a contract called the ketubah, which nowadays might even be considered prenuptial, like what some people might call prenup. And we as Christians would call that dangerous, which, that's arguable, I guess. I just found it interesting that back then that was actually standard procedure, is they would have a literal contract and it would lay out the event of divorce or whatever, how that all would take place and who would receive what. And um, some of that might even come into play as early as the first day. There was a lot hanging on to that proof of virginity that you were alluding to. That's why everybody was waiting in the wings with eager anticipation, one way or the other. Um, the bride had her witnesses, the groom had his witnesses, and it might be considered symbolic of Judgment Day, which is why I kind of chimed in a little bit there. Um, to where, when we come before the throne, are we going to be found virgin? Are we going to be found pure? And, if not, the bride back then might have been stoned, might have been divorced. There are a couple different scenarios that might have played out, but none of them good, obviously. Um, but nowadays we fall in love generally is how we do things. We find somebody attractive, we fall in love, and we basically it all is in kind of the reverse process of the way they used to do it, and also the reverse process of how it works with us and Messiah, I guess, because all of that is very much tied into messianic symbolism. At first it might seem transactional, but they expected romance to blossom over time, and the good parts of marriage and the good parts would all come, but they were very much concerned about laying a foundation. And, I don't know that we necessarily have to follow step by step everything that they did ritually and all of that, but I think the principle behind setting a good foundation and the groom being in a good place financially to take care of a bride and potential children and all of that is obviously something that even to this day we can learn from and put in place. And but like you had said, that's obviously not very much practiced these days. We have abortion on demand, and fathers that have children with multitudes of women in some cases, not taking responsibility for them until they are ordered by the court to do so. And at that point, their wages are garnished. And at some point, some cases they don't have enough to cover everything for every child, and it's just a bad scenario. But in short, obviously, like I said, I don't think we can follow. We can. No, I should take that back. We could on an individual basis if we wanted to. We could go ahead and follow that pattern. I guess what I'm saying is we don't necessarily, as Gentile believers, need to follow all the ritualistic steps, but there are some principles that we can definitely glean from, and also principles that we can apply spiritually. As I said, because of all the symbolism, even Jesus used a lot of that symbolism to convey points in eschatology and so on.
Yep. So I guess tell us a little bit about your wedding. Now, I don't, you guys didn't marry Amish, correct? You,
No, I was never. She was also never a member of the Amish church. I was the youngest of 11 children, two of which remained Amish. So by the time it came down to me, there just wasn't a lot of expectation there. So, but it was a little bit different for her. She was the oldest. There was actually questions in her mind regarding that, but no, we didn't marry Amish, but we met in Spanish class. There was, I had gone to Ecuador earlier in my life. I think I was 19 or 20. I went to Ecuador, spent a couple months there, kind of rehabilitating myself from previous drug addictions that I had been involved in. And I was recently converted and just kind of getting over a lot of stuff. So I went to Ecuador, spent 2.5 months there, serving as a volunteer, and just kind of getting away from home and so on, and kind of got my feet wet with Spanish there. And anyway, so later on, when I was back home, was it a year or two later, there was a Mexican guy in the area just temporarily that was giving Spanish classes at a local coffee shop. And both of us ended up attending. And through that, we became acquainted, started dating. And I don't know, was it year later, probably a year and a half later, we were married.
wow, fancy.
Yep. So I mean, it was just basically I didn't I was fairly new in the faith. I did not go into the biblical traditions as much. Um, I guess back then it would have I would have realized that roles were a little reversed as far as bride and groom
Yeah.
taking the lead in weddings, and some of that bothered me a little bit. But other than that, and yeah, I guess in a vague sense, I was aware of it and tried to implement what I could or whatever. But mostly, it would have been a typical Western wedding, minus the superstitions that many of them have these days and have had throughout history.
Superstition. Cake
Yeah,
cutting
it's
and
it's
beautiful
surprising. It's
things.
amazing how many superstitions are still
Mhm. Yeah.
practiced in Western weddings.
Including the bouquet of flowers.
Right. Yeah, I guess traditionally that would have been a the torch that would have been carried before the bride in
Well,
Rome. And then,
well, there is traditions, but the one of them that I had read was actually kind of funny. It was, they used to be superstitious back in the day of not taking too many baths, and they would typically do that at the end of spring. They would take their annual bath. And that's why there was a thing connected to June weddings. Like for whatever reason, June weddings were like perfect. And that's
also the goddess
because
Eunice, right? Right?
no, because of the time frame. So it was
Okay.
warming up and they still smelled reasonably fresh. And yet there was some BO involved. So to smell the absolute best, they would like carry a bouquet of flowers so that the scent of flowers would be stronger than the body odor.
Gotcha.
Um, that's where the bouquet of flowers kind of came from my understanding. So, it's unusual, but again, now everybody's got to carry a bouquet of flowers down.
And also the spreading of petals down the aisle was to purify the path of the bride, right?
Yeah, yeah, and then all of that stuff. I mean, you're just going to get that, especially with Western Christianity coming out of Catholicism.
Right.
Catholicism mixed a lot of ancient practice into their thing. So, like it or not, we're probably more influenced by the way they did weddings than the way the biblical weddings were done. But for ourselves, I mean, so we came out of non-denominational type church, but ultimately my parents were Amish, left the Amish before I was born. And I was concerned, like I wanted to try to have a more biblical wedding and didn't really know how to do that. And it was seemingly offensive to people, which is okay. But basically, what we did is a little bit like emphasis wise. We actually walked in at the same time and we got married first. So, it's classic Matt Weaver, different, has to be different, can't follow the normal path and just do the old traditional wedding in everybody's mind and yada, yada, yada. So basically, she walked down the aisle and I walked in a side door with groomsmen behind me and her with her bridal party at the same time. And her Uncle Joe, got him to blow the shofar. And that's what started it. We all walked in at the same time. And then we walked up front, up to the platform, and we got married right away. And that was kind of a departure. I was very People were shocked.
I mean,
And then,
nowadays people get married any which way, but back
yeah,
then,
it wouldn't
you
be
know,
that crazy nowadays. I mean, but anyway, so we got married and then I went and sang a few songs, that was probably the only thing I wouldn't do again because, there's some emotion involved and you're trying to belch out some songs. It's kind of embarrassing to watch. So maybe someday I'll have the courage to watch the tapes. Yay. But
serenading your wife.
no, it was people thought it was special, but for myself, it was hard for me to get the songs out. But
Right.
it's whatever. It was romantic-ish, esque, sort of. And then anyway, we sat and we had a message in our church. They had always viewed it. We were always seen as kind of strange. Um, and for whatever reason, this was a chance where you had a lot of different people show up at an event, and that's so our ministry generally steered people to try to do more of an evangelistic, almost kind of message at weddings because it was seen as
Because
somewhat more of an ability to outreach to people.
yeah,
And that is actually how some people came to our church because they heard a message at a wedding and they were like, I've never heard anything like that at a wedding, and that was considered to be positive. Um, but not necessarily that is a biblical thing. That was just, that's something the way it was more done in our church. And then after we had the reception, and the reception is I don't know. I mean, that's where our culture gets us in trouble. we're not party animals. We don't party. No party.
Right.
Having soda on the table might be a little extreme. Um, you know, so I mean, we have this very stale. I mean, it's a good food and some conversation and thanks for coming and yada yada yada. The one thing that we didn't do is we didn't do the whole cake cut. I mean, we had a cake, but we just didn't smash cake into each other's faces. Partially because I'm like, it just doesn't make any sense to me. I mean, where does that come from? Grabbing a
Right.
cake and then throwing it into each other's face does not seem like a very important part of life, I guess. Um, so I had some of those, I guess, peculiarities. The other thing I did is my grandparents, on my dad's side, my grandparents on my mom's side had passed away, but my grandparents on my dad's side, and he was an Amish bishop, and I respected him. You know, he was always fair to the family. He never did the shunning, and you know, there was never that type of hostility. He respected my dad, and he treated us respectfully, and I wanted to honor him. And I knew that, for instance, this groomsman wearing ties in the Amish culture are about as flagrant as you can get. It's, you know, that's a big obstacle to overcome. And I felt like it would just, I think he would consider it honorable for us not to wear some kind of crazy colored tie or something. And so I just
Mhm.
refrained. This guys just didn't wear ties, which nowadays, again, it's not a big deal, but back then it was a bigger deal. And and so we didn't. And yeah, I mean, he actually had made some comments after that there was things about the wedding he appreciated. To me, that's about as good as it gets, you know, from an Amish grandparent to have a little bit of approval is you're doing all right. So, but no,
Yep.
I wanted to honor him, and I felt it would be dishonoring to yeah, I don't know, just to be loud about it. There's no point in, you know, garnering dishonor from grandparents. So those are some of the things, and yeah, it wasn't everybody's. Not everybody was happy. That's the way it went, and but you know, it is what it is. The other thing that was kind of a rule my dad had made in the church for people that got married at church is that all the and I understand it, but basically it's like if you want me involved in your wedding, here's one of the conditions, uh, and that is that all the bridal party are believers.
Okay.
Um, and his reasoning there is you're up there trying to preach or do a religious ceremony, and you know there's people there that are not believers. It's just extremely awkward, and
Gotcha.
I it is. I'll be honest with you, it is kind of awkward. Like, you know, all of a sudden if
Probably
they're
wondering what's going through their mind while you're preaching
well,
and
and
so
if you're
on.
evangelistic for sure, all of a sudden they're, you know, they're sweating and chewing gum and doing weird things. So it's not. I think it started after he, and I'm not going to use names, but after he was, it was a family member's wedding that he had spoke at, and this was a very awkward, like a difficult situation. These people had not necessarily been living right, and then you had on top of that all these other, you know, people that aren't living right in the party, and it was just as a minister extremely awkward to get up in front of this and try to do this in a Christian way. So, but anyway, that had kind of followed through. And so there was a little bit of a tension in the family, not necessarily I'm not going to use names, but there were some people upset about that stipulation, I guess. So, but I didn't think it was a big deal. It is what it is, but you know, some people, like it or not, have really vivid ideas of the way things should be. So I'm not using
Yeah, it's
names.
interesting. It's interesting to me how personally some people take it, if a certain event, especially weddings, are not done by their standards
Oh
or,
yes.
you
Yeah.
know,
And it's not really that there's a reason to do it that particular way. It's just preferences, you know,
tradition and preference, yes,
and it's like
prejudice.
don't mess with that. That's in my mind what should be done. We should do it that way.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know. So, but if you going back to the biblical scene, you know, the biggest difference, and I honestly don't know how you really pull it off in our culture, but it was a party. I mean, there was music and dancing and wine, and it went on for days. And that's the context of Jesus' first miracle.
Right.
He goes to a party. And some of that is too because people are coming from a distance. They're going to spend a couple days because it took them a couple days to get there. And but weddings were like the cultural event. And so basically, people went all out. It was, feasting and drinking and partying and dancing and joy and yeah, not the
Yep.
solemn religious service maybe that we would tend to throw at it nowadays. At least from our point of view, I guess more so. And then yeah, I don't know. I have mixed feelings on how to if I was to deal with a wedding again, like as far as my kid's wedding, or if I was to go back in time and do it over again, what would I change? I don't think I would change the ceremony part. That actually worked out quite well because I liked that whole what I was communicating. Like it's two people coming together, it that aligns with kind of biblical precedent. And then the only thing, in our culture to have more of a exciting celebration, it's just hard. I don't know how you break that culturally.
Yeah, I
Uh,
mean, we have Puritan roots here in
we
America,
do,
and it's
boy, do we.
I mean, it has its advantages and its good parts, but the focus on holy living and all that is good, but
No.
obviously God also is a God who enjoys celebration sometimes.
Well, I interestingly enough was talking to an Amish man yesterday afternoon, and he said something to me. I just laughed. It was so perfect. He said, "Well, because he's a very observant guy, and he just said, "Well, have you ever seen somebody who's dancing angry?"
Yeah, there's some truth to that.
Nope. These are people they're not angry. They can't dance if you're angry.
Right.
It's not dancing. It's interesting.
Indeed.
It's
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah. So no,
Yeah,
in
I
the
mean
Jewish
every
culture,
principle can get taken too far for sure.
well, dancing is a cultural thing, so like American dancing would be dishonoring. That's just, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, I'm not talking about twerking.
yeehaw. It's American dancing doesn't really have a I don't know how else to say it. It just doesn't have a vibe. It's fine. It's, a bunch of people up there. I mean, a slow dance could be
Are you
seen as
talking about Western
romantic.
dancing, maybe?
Well, I have been to a few weddings where they had like dancing. Okay, so a slow dance could be seen as romantic or whatever, yada yada yada. But and some of that could be okay, but it is a cultural thing. I've seen that in like Jewish weddings. The dancing for whatever reason doesn't seem inappropriate. I've
Okay,
seen dancing in uh yeah, other types of weddings where you kind of scratch your head and you're like, this is uncomfortable. This
right.
doesn't this is kind of weird.
Mm.
But then I've seen dancing done. I was just watching videos, not that I've been part of a Jewish wedding, but watching videos of, the celebratory atmosphere and the dancing involved in some of that. And it's actually beautiful. It's exciting. There's a lot of action. It's they're not singing party songs. They're singing songs that have some meaning to it, that are relevant. Not a lot of dancing, I guess, would be
Out of the Song of Solomon, perhaps.
useless. Well, I mean, I'm saying in America, a lot of useless. Like you go to the reception and there's a DJ back there pumping out pop music
Right.
for people to go dance with, and that part that doesn't do anything for me. Sorry, I'm not. If people want that, I guess that's up to them. But as far as like from like, there's no like, wow, that was beautiful. They're dancing over
Right.
there.
Well,
But
there's no depth to.
historically, but biblically speaking, there was dancing. There was joy expressed at weddings. There was music and dancing and drinking and eating and yeah,
Right.
gift giving.
Yeah, I mean, all in all, there's not a lot of depth to American pop culture, so that's why I suppose you don't feel any depth when you see that kind of dancing and music and so on going on in American weddings. Our pop culture has been diluted and watered down quite a bit, whereas in the East, obviously, they have more traditional values and traditional music and so on, I'm sure.
Kind of like presidential balls, you know, that's awkward. These people come in and then slow dance up on an elevated platform awkwardly because you can tell they don't dance a lot. And they're awkwardly dancing on stage and then they leave and then they go to the next place and do the same thing. That's kind of weird. But dancing, how would I say it? Where it's not weird is if it's in your culture. Um, First time we were in Israel, we were invited by an Arab family to their place, and one of the things he wanted to show us was like their tribes, you know, or their families' dancing style. Like, here, we want to show you how we dance. And it was revealing. It's like, well, that's part of their culture. You know, that is a way they express themselves, and we don't have anything to relate that to coming from the Anabaptists. You know, they just don't dance. They don't have a good way
Right.
to
In
do it.
fact, their
Don't
music
dance.
was created. Their music was created to prevent that. Actually, is
No,
from my
I'm sure.
understanding. You know, the way they do their slow mantra singing
Yes, the
is so that
chants.
people can't actually not. Yeah, they
And
can't.
we
So
can't
people
have any
can't dance
expressions
to
of joy, no soulish expressions. We must sit there and hang on to a word for 30 seconds
it.
before we
Yeah, it's
advance to the
amazing
next
how
word of
long
the
they can
song.
stretch that out.
Slow this, slow singing, slow chanting, really. But yeah, that's interesting. Well, what else do you have for us?
um, Not sure that I have a ton. We've covered, you know, the actual ceremony and process of the biblical wedding is, you know, it is what it is. It's kind of a list of things that are always kind of follow the same pattern, and I think we've pretty much covered that. Um, as far as the afterward is a different story, but the whole process leading up to it. But it is interesting how long their process is. Um, you know,
Mhm.
nowadays people might get to know each other and be married in a very short amount of time. Whereas for them, the betrothal process was actually pretty long, um,
Yeah.
and sometimes up to a year.
Mhm.
And with that, you know, it's also us waiting on Jesus and that imagery, the way that the groom would then unannounced go and get the bride. You know, there's some details like that that I guess we could cover, but I think all in all, we've covered pretty much top to bottom. So
There was a guy from church, from our church that actually did do basically a biblical wedding without the alcohol and the
okay,
dancing, but everything else was basically on the spot. And it was really fascinating to be a part of. So I was part of the wedding party there. And it was actually, if your culture was into that sort of thing, it's really neat. It really is because you can tell a story with it.
sure.
Um, Kind of like you said, pointing to the Messiah, you can tell a story with it. You know, most weddings, it's just, you know, you basically walk in, get married, a little motivational, sentimental, feel good talking about being nice to each other and loving each other, and then you make these vows, and then you go eat, um, and then you get out of there to the throwing of rice or birdseed, getting pelted as you walk out. Right?
Yeah,
I We didn't do that, by the way.
yeah, we didn't
Um,
either.
didn't really want to have birdseed in my hair for days. Boring. But anyway, so there I was part of the bridal party. We went to a location and we waited. And then the bridal, like the bride's side of the party was also they were at, if I remember right, they were at the church, but they were waiting. And they didn't know exactly when it was going to start. People Guests were seated in the was at in a gym of a church, and they were seated. They were given like snacks and stuff on the table as they waited, and they were just talking and they were sitting there waiting. And there wasn't a set time
Wow.
for the wedding to start. And it was basically all on the groom's father to make the call and said, it's time to go get your bride.
Interesting.
And so, yeah, us groomsmen were hanging out at a place and we were just waiting until we get the phone call that it's time.
Wow.
And all of a sudden the phone rings and all right, it's time. And then we get into vehicles and we drive over to the celebration. And as we walk in, they, if I remember right, there's blowing of shofars and um, walked into the space, walked up front, had the wedding right away, and like in front of the reception, and basically then proceeded to after got married, and then had the whole feast, and it was really neat. It was really neat. It was I went partial, right? We went partial, and we kind
What
of
do you
did
mean?
sort well like our wedding. We didn't do the whole
Oh, your
off-site
wedding
all
was
that stuff, but
partially.
it
Yeah.
was really neat to be part of it. It was like it had meaning, it had value. You saw a picture play
Yeah.
out that would remind you, kind of like you said, remind you of that story of Jesus coming back. We don't know the day or the hour. And I mean, logistically in the ancient world, it was just the fact that, this guy could have been from many towns away. And at some point, he's going to be walking into town to get his wife.
Right.
And the bride is waiting because she doesn't know when it's going to happen. There's no phone calls, text messages, or emails that will happen. And so basically she doesn't know. So every night they're up there, they're lighting lamps. The tradition was that they would light oil lamps and light part of the street up with a couple lamps that led to the bride's house, so that if that night he would come, then he could find his way. And and basically, they would come with some noise that there's a wedding party is on its way, and they would make sure the lamps are lit every night, and in anticipation that the bride was ready because it could happen anytime. And then boom, it happened. So to be able to actually play that out, and that was a Galilean style wedding, which maybe is different from other regions, but it's still fascinating to be part of, like really neat, really meaningful. Um, and and then here it is. The
So what
bride
about the
shows up and the
guests?
groom shows up and the guests. What?
So what about the guests? Like, do they, I guess the one part I was not quite clear on was like how on a spur of the moment notice do they come
No,
to this
they
huge
were supposed to
celebration?
be. You mean as far as in the Bible?
Right. In biblical weddings, like obviously there's no notice except the father and the son. They know that it's now time to go get your bride. But how
Well,
do they fill the wedding?
the invitations would go out. Hey, a
Okay.
wedding is taking place. Make your way to so and so.
Okay, but the bride just wouldn't be aware of it.
Well, no, she could be. She just didn't know when he's approaching.
Okay.
You know what I
What about
mean?
the guests? Do they know the
She knew
exact?
like within a couple day period that he's coming. So she's not
Gotcha.
sitting out there every night for a year
Gotcha.
lighting lamps. She just knows that as the wedding draws closer, any night, any one of the few nights is when he's showing up. So she would make sure she's ready and have the lamps lit. And
And
then
same with
people
the
would
guests, I
stream in
suppose.
from the communities because they knew, I mean, you would use a in your invitation, you would say, 2 new moons from now or whatever, because they were lunar calendar, or whatever. You could use a date, and then people would make their way to the area. And then these things lasted a week.
Right.
So guests would show up when the ceremony itself was not really part of the guest thing. It was people showed up to the party, if you will, and to celebrate the wedding. But the wedding itself, or the marriage itself, the covenantal ceremony was done between, the father's family, mother's family, a
Hmm.
couple close friends, and a religious leader, basically. But as far as then the party would take place, and yeah, I mean, there was a general sense of time, but it was basically like if you were getting married, you're walking from your town to her town to get her.
Hmm.
You don't know exactly what time you're going to show up. So it was this anticipation of, well, he's on his way. I just don't know where he's at. Is he
Right.
coming? Is it tonight? Is it tomorrow night? So, and would
Yeah.
have been dishonoring to not have lamps out and preparations
Yep.
not ready and anticipation not being there. It would have been a dishonoring thing. So, yeah.
Yep. Yeah,
So in
very
short, what
interesting.
have we concluded? Most Christian weddings aren't really biblical.
Yeah, probably in short, that's the way it is.
Oh,
But
that's fun.
most Christians, if they're faithful Christians, at least have some of the principles established
Yeah.
of
But it is
preparation and so
interesting.
on.
But it is interesting to me, it is interesting to look, I'm assuming here, but I would have assumed that most people in a lot of ways they consider me to be a kind of out there maybe and maybe have weird ideas about things. I tend to find myself thinking along the lines of actual orthodoxy, like what
Right.
it actually says. And for that I'm labeled as strange.
But the
Um,
orthodoxy goes so far back that people have forgotten it, and so it's strange.
Basically, yeah. They feel like, Christian wedding is basically before a Christian minister and that's fine. That's just not biblically speaking. It was all about the party and the act of making it one, making it a covenant. So
Yep,
there it is.
indeed.
Don't hate on us too bad. Oh well.
It's just history.
It's just history. It's culture and history. Got to get over it, I guess. So all right. Well, thank you. And we'll have another exciting one in the future.